Hello, my name is Ben Mitchell, and this is my submission for discussion board. I did the article by Douglas Warrenowski titled Jonathan Edwards, Enthusiast, Radical Revivalism, and the Great Awakening in the Connecticut Valley. It spends most of its time discussing Jonathan Edwards and his famous sermons of the Great Awakening. You had the infield, the sinners in the hands of an angry God, which is probably the most famous one. And the big thing this article discusses is, was Jonathan Edwards really an enthusiast? Was he really a radical? Because he's consistently grouped in that era, but the fact is he's not in what we would say the traditional sense of being an enthusiast or a radical. He was not the stand up on the barrel in front of 30,000 people and scream about the end of days and revelations and get saved now before it's too late. That was more George Whitefield. I remember teaching my students, I teach HIUS history, and I remember teaching my students about the Great Awakening and saying that George Whitefield spoke in Philadelphia one time. He stood on a barrel and he was surrounded by people, and Benjamin Franklin, who was his great friend, took a walk, and he said he could hear him from at least 500 yards away. And then he just did the calculations and stuff, and he said maybe anywhere from like 50 to 70, maybe even 100,000, those calculations could have been off, heard him speak. Jonathan Edwards was not that type of speaker. He was very reserved in what he did. He was a quiet man. Unlike most of the Puritan preachers of the day, he was very open to the sciences and the Enlightenment and things like that. He was not enthusiastic in the sense of he showed it with his arms and his speech and his screaming and things like that, but more so the knowledge and the logic of being a Christian and trying to live a Christian life, to obey God's ordinance and such. He was very much a knowledgeable man, sort of a Christian enlightened man. I did make some notes. I have them right here. I'll read off of these. Jonathan Edwards was a prominent figure of the Great Awakening. He was a New England Congregational preacher and theologian, known for his fire and brimstone sermons. And when I broke it down, the fire and brimstone sermons, those are the, get saved before it's too late. Otherwise, you will spend your days where you don't want. It will not be in heaven. And he didn't scream that, but he spoke it. And in some cases, it's actually more, it means more when you just say it. But he was known for his need for personal conviction, deep emotional connection to God. His most famous sermon was Sinner in the Hands of an Angry God. His revivalist type of preaching and what it did was it invoked a strong emotional response in the congregation. That was where the radical revivalism and the enthusiasm was. He spoke, the words he spoke struck a chord with so many people. It was the fervent, the emotional nature of the religious experience of the Great Awakening, which was running rampant. George Whitefield was going up and down the colonies speaking. Samuel Davies was speaking in Eastern Virginia. Jonathan Edwards, though, was the New England guy. It was the time when people were encouraged to engage in intense religious experiences, marked with emotional outbursts, intense prayer, and personal revelations. I've been to Pentecostal churches. I've been to revivals, tent revivals and such. I live in Southwest Virginia. That it's kind of a big deal down here. And you see these people. You see the ones that cry out and they speak in tongues and they faint and such. And Jonathan Edwards wasn't necessarily that type of preacher, but he invoked that same response in that. Some saw this enthusiasm as a positive force that led to spiritual renewal, but others saw it with suspicion and fear that it could disrupt social order and religious orthodoxy. And I wrote my conclusion here. Some historians argue that Edwards himself was initially cautious about the excessive enthusiasm displayed during the Great Awakening, and he wanted to strike the balance of fervor and maintaining order within the church. You got to remember, he was a Puritan, and they were not they were not very enthusiastic in just about anything they did, except the fact that you should be in church and you should be obeying the Lord. They didn't speak out of turn or speak with a large voice. It was very reserved, it was very cautious. But over time, he became associated with this movement, the revivalist movement. Him and Whitefield are the two fire and brimstone preachers that speak the most of. But this article by Warnarski, it just broke it down into the sense that he was an enthusiast, and a radical revivalist, but in a different sense of what we are accustomed to seeing now in, within the Bible Belt and such. It was just a different time, but it was all invoked the same response. So, thank you.